Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we see the belongings of a World War I soldier, the contents of a World War I ditty bag, and a German sextant from World War II. Jennifer looks at a naval sextant used by a German U-boat during the Second World War.
I don't think it's as important to hold on to them as it is to make sure that people are educated about what it was, what it represented, who used it.
Gary combs through the contents of Lieutenant James Holland's ditty bag.
I think it's important to illustrate that simple, everyday objects have a story to tell as well.
Andrew takes a look at several pieces that tell of Private Fred Publicover's military service and death.
I think that it's very important that we preserve our history. What these young men did that I talked about today, what all those young women did, and how they opened up the doors for these new generations that came after them. My name is David Crocker. I have a rather interesting hobby of collecting a lot of militaria. I brought in Fred Publicover's collection. In this collection is a picture of him. There's his medals, there's his death certificate, and there's also a certificate of his service there as well.
The number of deaths resulting from the Great War, including civilians caught in the crossfire, totaled nearly 40 million. While civilian deaths are harder to estimate, it is believed to be around 13 million. To notify families of their loss, a telegram was dispatched by a country's government or war correspondents. Medals earned, photos, and other commemorative items would then follow, which for members of the British Empire included a large circular bronze medallion. This next of kin memorial plaque featured the name of the fallen but withheld rank as a demonstration of equality across sacrifice. Circumstances surrounding the plaque's issue led to macabre nicknames like the Dead Man's Penny, the Widow's Penny, the Death Plaque, and the Death Penny. In total, a staggering 1,355,000 plaques were issued between 1914 and 1918.
Dave, welcome to Militaria.
Oh, thank you.
Why don't you tell us what you've brought for us today?
Well, today I brought in a collection that belonged to Fred Publicover. I have a picture of Fred here when he had enlisted along with his next door neighbor, Dewey. He unfortunately was killed, so I have his memorial coin. I have his medals, and I have the card that came back to his mother that has a picture of his grave and its location in the card.
So, Dave, why don't you tell us how you came across these items?
Well, I have a exhibit in the shopping center in Bridgewater, and the lady came in with the collection in a box and Fred's picture that hung in the house, and she said that she really didn't have anyone to leave it to. And she asked if I was willing to take it and put it in my display. And I quite gratefully took the items and plan to keep Fred's memory alive.
Wow, that's great. As you know, Dave, Fred Publicover, who was young, had a chance to join the military. At that time in Canada, it was a very rural place. You know, the chance to get out, see the world was the lure for a lot of young men. It was a chance for Canadians to show their patriotism. And at that time, patriotism was very important. And a lot of people don't understand that Canada was an all-volunteer force up until 1917. But up until that time, everyone that was fighting on the front lines was a volunteer, and a lot of people don't understand that.
That duty to empire, to king, to country was very important to all of them. Like Dewey ended up with the 85th Battalion. So the 85th were renowned for taking Hill 145 at Vimy Ridge.
Yep.
Vimy Ridge was the defining time where the whole Canadian Army came together and did what the French and the British could not do. In a few hours, they did what they couldn't do in years and cemented our reputation as elite troops.
Yeah, that's right.
And as well as giving us a sense of identity as Canadians.
And we actually were known as shock troops. We were placed in the front lines when a job had to be done and a difficult job had to be done, and we were there. And Germans would even get nervous when they knew that the Canadians were opposite them because they knew it wasn't going to be a good outcome for them.
Oh, yes, they were renowned for their trench raids and things like that.
Yeah.
So,
Dave, you got some great items here. What can you tell us about the individual who's represented here?
he served through from the time he was 17 until he was 19. And unfortunately, about a month and a half before the war ended, he was picked off by a sniper. He ended up with a bad leg wound and unfortunately passed.
Now, he was killed on September 28th. Is that correct? So that was, for historical, perspective, that was the last 100 days, as you well know. It was, I believe, the 47th Battalion diary mentions that the battle would have been the Canal du Nord, where he was killed. And that's a really interesting bit about him being picked off by a sniper. That's tragic. But yeah, a fascinating story. The last 100 days, of course, consisted of many battles up until 1918 when the armistice was signed. I think there were about 20,000 Canadian casualties at that point during the last 100 days. And really the German army was pushed back from beginning of August all the way to November 11th. There was firing going right up to that day.
Yeah.
So a tragic story, but fascinating time as well.
Yeah, it's just one of the many tragic stories coming from the First World War.
So Dave, you've brought these items for us today. It's a nice, tight group of material that's pertinent to one individual, which we don't always see these days. What's your motivation for collecting these things?
I started collecting several years ago. For me, it was personal. Lost my father when he was young. He had just retired from the Navy. I have his uniforms and some of his collection certificates and things. For me, it became a way to remember my father. And when I started collecting and adding more things to the collection and collecting more stories, and people reached out, they had their own family stories and they wanted to see their loved ones remembered. So they would approach me with things, and the collection has grown and grown to where things like Fred has come into my collection and several other people, and it continues to grow. And for me, it's become a duty, I guess. They served for us. They sacrificed for us. They did their duty. So I feel it's only right we do our duty to them. So this is why I do this.
Dave, thanks for bringing all these things in. What were your plans for these items?
These items are going to go back into the display I have in Bridgewater, and eventually they'll find themselves traveling around to other museums and to schools. I think it's important that his story, as well as the stories of so many others, are related along to our youth, so they understand how our freedoms came to be.
Thanks for bringing these items in. I love your passion, and I think it's a great thing to be educating the youth like that. Fantastic, and good luck to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I really enjoyed today's segment because I got to talk to Dave. Dave's a very passionate collector, and I just love the fact that he shares his passion with people.
Coming up on Militaria.
Something as simple as a ditty bag. It seems simple, but even those simple items have a story to tell. My name is Shara Kingston. I brought in a ditty bag belonging to James Holland.
At the onset of the First World War, Nova Scotia engaged in provincial-wide recruitment efforts to establish infantry battalions and supplement Canada's standing army and militias. The 85th Battalion, also known as the Nova Scotia Highlanders, was authorized on September 14, 1915, as one of the two entirely volunteer-based units. Its 4 companies trained in Halifax and added 3 additional units before traveling overseas. Their first frontline experience transpired on Hill 145 Vimy Ridge, where instead of providing non-combat support, they squared off against the Germans. With formidable tenacity, the 85th Battalion helped seize the ridge. Efforts made there and throughout Europe would earn them the nickname, the Never Fails, and a memorial in northern France where their legacy began.
Shara, welcome to Militaria, and can you tell us what you brought in today from the Army Museum?
Absolutely. So I brought in what is known as a ditty bag, which is this bag here, with some ephemera and items that were inside the ditty bag. And it belonged to a Lieutenant Holland who served with the 85th.
And that's the 85th Canadian Infantry Battalion from the First World War. So, as you say, we have the ditty bag here, which was like basically a hold-all bag for things that you needed to keep your uniform together. And in it he had a spare set of hose flash. There was part of a formation patch, the top half. 2 cotter pins here. The cotter pins were used to hold the shoulder titles on, or the collar badges on, or even a cap badge. These 2 items there are for the sides of the tunic, and they were to hold the belt in place. So they assisted so it didn't slip down too far. And then of course we have the ubiquitous buttons that were used for whatever. They're not a button that I recognize, but it doesn't mean if you lost a button, it wouldn't do the trick. So how did we obtain this item?
So this was one of the items, again, that we call it found in the collection, as we're not sure how it came to us, but using our detective skills, the fact that he signed his bag, we were able to start to parcel out the bit of the story.
So Shara, what do we know about Lieutenant Holland?
Well, we know that he enlisted with the 185th, and then he was transferred to the 85th after the 185th disbanded. We know that he became a lieutenant, and we know that he was shot in the ear in 1916 and sustained a pretty severe kind of ear and head wound and was on leave for a while to recuperate from that. We also know that he was killed because someone wrote on his ditty bag, "killed" with the date, which is how we were able to kind of piece together who he was and a little bit more of his story. He was killed in the last 100 days, which is pretty devastating.
And then the other interesting thing was the fact that in his service file are all the documents for his officer selection. Someone must have saw something in Holland that said he should be an officer as opposed to a private, put him in front of an officer selection board, and they decided, yep, you need to be a lieutenant in the 85th Battalion, and that's how he became a leader and a platoon commander in the 85th. So Shara, what have you been able to find out about Holland and his service and any of the wounds he received, that sort of thing?
From what I have gathered from his records, but also there's a really great account of the 85th Battalion where each day is almost written about and people are mentioned very specifically, is that Holland was the guy that would take charge and do what he was asked to do, but that when he's shot in the ear, he just wants to get back into the field. And he wasn't just like zinged, it was a, flesh into the head where they said, please take some time off. And he did a little bed rest, but he kept saying, I'm ready, I can keep going. So that says something about his determination, his courage, the fact that he understood that he had a job to do. Yeah, that's as far as I know, shows his courage.
Yeah, and the last 100 days, of course, was the last 100 days of the war. And that's when things sort of started getting moving, in that there was the Canadian Army and well, in fact, all of the Allies were at a point where they were able to advance and pursue the Germans and make ground and advance. And that's where you see some of the last cavalry charges, because the Army was actually moving and the Canadian Corps was moving. They were able to use the cavalry brigade in cavalry charges because things were moving so fast and they were on open ground and they weren't all bogged down into the mere and mud and stuff. So it was a different fighting then. That's when tanks were able to be used to their utmost, and it wasn't a good easy go, mind you. It was still horrible slogging, but at least they were going in the right direction. It wasn't the early days of the war where you would advance and lose half of a battalion for 10 feet.
Right.
This was moving along quite well. And again, as you were saying about Holland, when I was reading the medical portion, it kept saying, yes, he's back again, and he says he's ready to go, and we'll have another inspection of his ear. But it sure sounded to me when I was reading through that there wasn't much of his ear left.
No.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if he didn't want to come back, they may have found something else for him to do. But he seemed to have that dedication and wanted to get back, and there's probably a lot of camaraderie going on too, that those were his soldiers and he wanted to get back to his soldiers and look after his men. So he seemed to be quite the leader. This item came out of storage, obviously, and before it goes back into storage, what are your plans to stabilize it, or is there anything that really needs to be stabilized?
So because this all came as a grouping, I would never break this up. So we make sure that everything is bagged individually or wrapped in tissue individually and then put back in the housing that it came in, which would be the Ditty bag. And then it is wrapped and put away. Again, I don't want to clean the textile. This was all written in pen, so I don't want to clean it and then lose that information. So that all gets packed away. I think it's important to note, though, that sometimes something as simple as a Ditty bag or a sewing kit or what have you, it seems simple to look at and to maybe walk past in a museum, but even those simple items have a story to tell. And perhaps this could be, part of an online exhibit or part of a study. It's very possible. We have lots of people who come and study personalities in the war, and this becomes part of a study on Holland. So it's still important to keep these things, even though they seem kind of simple or meaningless to the average person.
So thank you so much for bringing this in, Shara, and giving us something new to talk about.
Thank you very much for having me. I chose this artifact to share because I think it's important to illustrate that simple, everyday objects have a story to tell as well, that you can look at them just for their beauty and efficiency at doing their job, but also that sometimes there's information in there that will help round out a bigger story.
Coming up on Militaria.
Before Google Maps, once you were out of sight of land in a ship, the only method of navigation you had was the sextant. My name is Jerry White. I am a retired naval officer and former member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I bought in a sextant. The particular one that I bought in is a German naval sextant from the Second World War era.
Imperial German naval submarines, or U-boats, were a powerful force that prowled the waters throughout the Battle of the Atlantic. First introduced during the Great War, U-boats were a primary source of peril between 1939 and 1945, stalking Allied merchant ships in the North Atlantic, moving in groups called wolf packs. The Germans, like all submariners, relied on special navigation techniques to produce highly accurate positioning during their hunt. The instrument of choice was the sextant, which provided angular distance between two objects and allowed users to determine latitude by relating celestial bodies to the horizon. Since its inception in 1731, sextant technology has never depended on a power source and, despite its age, serves as a navigational safety net for many sailors today, including the Royal Canadian Navy.
Hi, Jerry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jennifer.
What have you brought us today?
It is a sextant. It is a primary navigational aid for celestial astronavigation.
And what is unique about this particular piece?
This particular sextant, you'll notice on it there's a German eagle and a swastika and the Wehrmacht symbol on it. This particular sextant was used by a German U-boat commander in the Second World War. During the Battle of the Atlantic and any other operations before, during, or since, if there was an interaction between an Allied ship and a German submarine, if they torpedoed a ship, they would have had to surface. If it was nighttime, they would have had to do a star sight. If it was daytime, they would have had to use a sun sight.
Most sextants are made of brass. This one doesn't seem to be made of brass, and why is that?
These were mass-produced like everything else on both sides during the Second World War. But these are made of an alloy that is actually more rigid than brass, but they were using all the brass to make shells. Sextant could be made of something else, so they didn't want to use brass.
Jerry, how did you acquire the sextant?
I have a friend whose father was a destroyer captain, and to the best of my knowledge, a U-boat surrendered in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, and when it surrendered, it was just seized. It was taken, and he bequeathed it to me because he knew I would take proper care of it. This would have been drawn from the company in Germany that manufactures them, Plath, and they still manufacture sextants. It would have been drawn by Admiral Eric Rader's or Admiral Carl Dunnitz's staff, either one of them, and then given to the commander of the U-boat, probably by Carl Dönitz himself, who was the father of the Second World War German U-boat fleet.
I always find U-boat artifacts very fascinating. U-boats were a very elite fighting machine. At the beginning of the war in 1939, Hitler had quite a fleet of them, and he deployed them on the Atlantic to attack Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic from Halifax, from New York, all the way to Britain and Ireland and beyond to supply the Allies. In fact, famously, Carl Dutz had actually asked Hitler, well, give me more boats and I will dominate the Atlantic and we'll win this war.
Glad he didn't.
And I'm glad he didn't. You're right, because he didn't get the boat. Slowly but surely, the Allies were able to beat back the U-boat menace on the Atlantic. So Jerry, you obviously have a lot of experience using this piece of equipment. Can you tell me why you would prefer to use a Sextant than perhaps modern GPS or other types of navigation equipment?
Sure, Jennifer. I carry one of these in my boat if I was going on a long trip. I have tons of navigation equipment. I have AIS, I have GPS, I have a chart plotter. They're all modern technology. And they all use electricity. And they are all subject to all sorts of breakdown. This is not. If I'm out at sea, I need to know exactly where I am. This will not break. It doesn't take batteries. I can take this out of the box at any time, point it at the sun, and take a sun line, and I will know exactly what latitude I am at, and I have a rough idea what longitude I am at, and then all you do is move your line up, and I will have an exact position, every bit as accurate as a position that a GPS would give me, and I don't have to worry about it breaking. This is probably close to 100 years old. It was used in 1939. It would probably have been manufactured around 1925 to 1935. So this is almost 100 years old. And it is as accurate and true, and the wheel is as precise as it was when it was built. And the stars don't move, and I don't need electricity, I don't need batteries. This is probably one of the most efficient and definitely the most accurate piece of navigational equipment ever designed. And it will be 100 years from now.
Jerry, what are your future plans for this artifact?
This is a rather unique artifact in that it represents a rather dark period in history, one which young people today either don't know about, or there are actually some people who don't believe it happened. This, I believe, should serve as a reminder that if we don't pay attention to the past, we're going to make the same mistakes in the future. When I reach my expiry date, I would like to have it placed somewhere where it can be available for people to see. Your museum would be a fine example of where it might end up.
Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for bringing this beautiful artifact in for us to see.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
My initial thoughts were, what a unique artifact. As it's been pointed out, it is a very rare artifact to have, and it represents a very unique part of our naval history. U-boats were a very formidable force on the Atlantic, and that story about fighting the U-boats on the Atlantic and getting the supplies and the troops to the Allied forces in Europe is such an important story to tell.